The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. marked a turning point in American history. A man who dedicated his life to fighting for justice, equality, and the peaceful end to racial segregation was suddenly gone, leaving behind a world that would never be the same. King was not just a leader, he embodied the hope for a brighter, fairer future. But how did it come to this? How did this great man, whose voice resonated around the world, meet such a tragic and violent end? Martin Luther. King Jr.'s life was filled with triumphs, challenges, and continuous battles for civil rights. His role in the civil rights movement of the 1960s changed the face of America, helping to secure legislative victories like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. His message of nonviolent resistance inspired millions worldwide and gave a voice to those oppressed by racial injustice. Yet despite his global recognition and the massive impact he had, King lived with constant threats and hostility, even from those who disagreed with his message of peace. Before we dive deeper into the events surrounding his death, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you're enjoying this content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue to bring you more in-depth and meaningful stories. King's death was not just the loss of a man, but the end of an era. A world of hope was suddenly thrust into mourning, and the impact of his assassination is still felt today. In this video, we'll explore the events leading up to that fateful day in 1968, the investigations that followed, and the lasting legacy that Martin Luther King Jr. left behind. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, into a deeply religious family. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a prominent Baptist minister, and from a young age, King was instilled with a sense of duty to advocate for justice and equality. His early life was marked by the harsh realities of racial segregation, which would later shape his commitment to fighting for civil rights. King's journey toward becoming a national leader in the civil rights movement began during his time at Morehouse College, where he was deeply influenced by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and the principles of nonviolence. After earning his doctorate in theology from Boston University, King became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, where he would begin to make his mark. His involvement in the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, sparked by the arrest of Rosa Parks, brought him into the spotlight as a leader of the modern civil rights movement. From that moment forward, King's leadership and advocacy grew. His nonviolent approach to resistance, inspired by Gandhi, proved to be a powerful weapon against systemic racism. Through peaceful protests, marches, and speeches, King was able to shift the national conversation on race, calling for an end to segregation, voting restrictions, and inequality. His most famous speech, "I Have a Dream," delivered during the March on Washington in 1963, continues to resonate around the world as a powerful call for racial harmony and justice. King's efforts were not without opposition. The more visible he became as a leader, the more threats he received. He was arrested more than 30 times and faced constant danger, yet he never wavered in his commitment to nonviolence. His ability to maintain a message of peace in the face of intense adversity made him one of the most revered figures of the 20th century. King's leadership not only led to social and legislative changes, but also inspired a generation of activists who continue his fight for equality. But the toll that this work took on King's personal life was undeniable. Constant stress, threats, and the emotional burden of witnessing so much injustice weighed heavily on him. As the years went on, King's message began to expand beyond civil rights for African Americans to include issues like poverty, economic inequality, and opposition to the Vietnam War, which made him an even more controversial figure in the eyes of some. His voice for peace and justice was stronger than ever, but so were the enemies he made along the way. Despite the overwhelming obstacles, King's determination to create a better world remained unwavering. He received numerous awards and honors, including the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Yet it was the love and respect he garnered from everyday people, those who followed him through marches and protests, that truly defined his legacy. His courage, in the face of danger, his steadfast belief in justice, and his commitment to peaceful change have made Martin Luther King Jr. one of the most influential figures in history. By the time Martin Luther King Jr. was tragically assassinated in 1968, the landscape of the United States was charged with political and social tensions. The civil rights movement had made significant strides, but racial inequality remained, deeply ingrained in American society. King's influence had extended beyond the fight for racial equality to include broader issues, such as economic justice and opposition to the Vietnam War. His stance on these matters, particularly his outspoken criticism of the war, had made him a controversial figure, even among those who had once been his allies. The late 1960s were a turbulent time in America. The civil rights movement had achieved landmark victories, but the fight for equality was far from over. Racial tensions had escalated, particularly in urban areas, where poverty and poor living conditions fueled frustration and anger. King, always a beacon of hope and peace, was now increasingly seen as a voice of dissent against the government's policies. His critiques of the Vietnam War were especially divisive, as they called into question not just the war itself, but the broader injustices within American society. In the face of mounting opposition, King was unwavering in his message of nonviolence and justice. However, this stance made him a target for many who saw him as a threat to the established order. Despite the recognition he had received, including his Nobel Peace Prize and widespread acclaim for his peaceful leadership, King had enemies who were eager to silence him. His calls for radical change, especially on issues like economic inequality, alienated both political conservatives and even some civil rights leaders who feared that his expanding agenda might fracture the unity they had fought so hard to achieve. By early 1968, King had become increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of progress. He had been involved in organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a movement that sought to address poverty across racial lines, and had plans to march on Washington again to demand jobs and economic justice. However, King was also experiencing great personal strain. He had faced numerous assassination attempts, and the constant threat to his life weighed heavily on him. Despite this, he never faltered in his commitment to the cause, continuing to speak out against injustice, even when it meant risking his life. During this time, King was also leading a series of marches to bring attention to the struggles of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. The workers were striking for better wages and working conditions, a cause that King championed as part of his broader fight against poverty. He saw this as part of his mission to address economic inequality, one of the greatest injustices of his time. Little did he know, this would be the last battle he would fight. On the evening of April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, just moments before his life was tragically cut short. King had arrived in Memphis to support the sanitation workers who were striking for better wages and working conditions. The strike, which had become a symbol of economic injustice, was something King had been deeply committed to, as it aligned with his broader vision for economic equality and social justice. That evening, King had just finished delivering a speech to a crowd at the Mason Temple Church. In his speech, King spoke of his own mortality, perhaps sensing that his time was running out. "I've been to the mountaintop," he said, "and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." These words would become some of the most poignant of his life, as they foreshadowed the tragedy that was about to unfold. As King stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he was struck by a single bullet fired from a nearby boarding house. The shot came from a distance, but it was deadly. King collapsed immediately, and though he was rushed to the hospital, he was declared dead shortly after his arrival. The news of his assassination spread rapidly, sending shockwaves throughout the country and the world. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was not just the loss of an influential leader. It was a devastating blow to the movement he had dedicated his life to. The reaction was immediate and profound. Across the United States, riots erupted in cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Baltimore as people mourned the loss of the man who had been their voice for justice. The streets, which had once been filled with peaceful marches, were now filled with anger and sorrow. The investigation into King's assassination began immediately, with authorities searching for the person responsible for this heinous crime. James Earl Ray, a fugitive with a criminal background, was quickly arrested and charged with the murder. Ray was apprehended in London 2 months after the assassination, and he was extradited to the United States. He pled guilty to the murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. However, questions about the circumstances surrounding King's death quickly arose. Despite Ray's guilty plea, many believed that there was more to the story. Some pointed to potential conspiracies involving the government, local authorities, and other groups that may have had a vested interest in silencing King's voice. The official narrative held that Ray acted alone, but doubts lingered, and the debate over who truly was responsible for King's death continues to this day. The impact of King's assassination went far beyond the immediate shock and grief that followed. His death became a defining moment in American history, one that sparked debates about race, violence, and the future of the civil rights movement. The nation was forced to confront the deep divisions that still existed and the lengths to which some would go to maintain the status quo. For many, King's death marked the end of an era of hope and progress, but it also served as a catalyst for continued activism in the years that followed. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. quickly became a subject of intense controversy. While James Earl Ray was arrested and charged with the crime, the circumstances surrounding King's death never fully added up in the eyes of many. The speed with which Ray was captured, his confession, and the questionable details surrounding his plea of guilty left many wondering if the official narrative was truly the whole story. Numerous theories about the assassination have surfaced over the years, many suggesting that Ray did not act alone. Some believe that there were multiple parties involved, including government agencies, local authorities, and even business interests, all of whom may have had reasons to silence King. This suspicion was fueled by the political climate of the time. King had become increasingly critical of U.S. foreign policy, particularly regarding the Vietnam War. His opposition to the war alienated some of his former allies, including political figures who had once supported his peaceful movement. His expanding platform, which included economic justice and critiques of systemic inequality, made him a target for those who feared his power to effect change. One of the most prominent figures to question the official account of King's death was his own family, particularly his widow, Coretta Scott King. She openly stated that she believed there was more to the assassination than what was reported, and she advocated for further investigation into the possibility of a conspiracy. Over the years, other members of King's family and close associates have echoed these concerns, calling for a deeper examination of the facts and evidence. They have suggested that the government might have been involved due to King's vocal opposition to the war and his influence on civil rights and social justice movements. These theories reached a new level of public attention in 1999 when a civil court trial found that the U.S. government could have been involved in a conspiracy to assassinate King. The trial was initiated by King's family, and during the proceedings, the jury concluded that the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was the result of a conspiracy. While the official investigation had concluded that Ray acted alone, the jury's decision questioned the validity of the government's findings and suggested that King's death might have been orchestrated by forces beyond Ray's control. This verdict reignited the debate over the true circumstances of King's death and raised questions about the U.S. government's role in the assassination of a prominent civil rights leader. In addition to the government conspiracy theories, there were also claims that Ray was not the assassin at all. Some of his supporters argued that he was a scapegoat, a man who had been coerced into confessing a crime he didn't commit. They pointed to discrepancies in the evidence and questioned whether Ray was capable of carrying out such a calculated murder. Others suggested that Ray's trial and subsequent guilty plea were part of a larger cover-up designed to protect those who were actually responsible for King's death. The theories surrounding King's assassination have persisted for decades, with many people continuing to believe that the truth has yet to be fully revealed. Whether it was an isolated act of violence or part of a larger conspiracy, the fact remains that King's death was a monumental moment in American history. His murder, regardless of who orchestrated it, represented the violent silencing of one of the most powerful voices for justice and equality the world had ever known. The immediate aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination sent shockwaves throughout the nation. Across the United States, people reacted with shock, anger, and deep sorrow. The news spread quickly, and within hours, major cities erupted in protests and riots. In Washington, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore, and many other cities, violent clashes between police and protesters became the tragic response to the loss of a man who had dedicated his life to non-violence. The riots were not just an expression of grief over King's death, but also a manifestation of the broader frustration and rage that had been building within African American communities. For many, King had been a symbol of hope and the belief that change could be achieved through peaceful means. His assassination shattered that belief and underscored the deep divisions that remained in American society. The response to his death was not only a reflection of the love and admiration people had for King, but also a stark reminder of the challenges still facing African Americans. Despite the violence, there were also powerful moments of unity and reflection in the aftermath of King's death. In the days following the assassination, leaders from all walks of life came together to honor King's legacy. Political figures, religious leaders, and civil rights activists called for peace and unity, urging the nation to carry forward King's message of nonviolent resistance. President Lyndon B. Johnson declared a national day of mourning, and the country came together to reflect on the tremendous loss of a man who had changed the course of history. The assassination also sparked a national conversation about the state of race relations in the United States. King had fought tirelessly for civil rights, but his death raised difficult questions about how far the country had truly come in its struggle for equality. The passage of landmark legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, had been significant victories, but the assassination of King highlighted the ongoing disparities in wealth, education, and political power between white and black Americans. King's death was a painful reminder that racial inequality was still deeply embedded in American society, and his vision for a more just world had yet to be realized. While the nation mourned King's death, his assassination also sparked renewed efforts to continue his work. In the wake of his passing, organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and other civil rights groups redoubled their efforts to address the issues King had championed. King's assassination helped galvanize the next generation of activists who took up his cause and continued the fight for racial equality, economic justice, and peace. Though the shock of King's death reverberated throughout the world, his impact was far from over. His legacy continues to inspire movements for social change, from the civil rights movement to today's Black Lives Matter movement. The struggle for justice and equality that King began did not end with his death. It lives on through the generations of individuals who carry his message forward. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, while devastating, did not mark the end of his influence. Instead, it solidified his place as one of the most iconic figures in American history, whose impact reverberates across generations. While his assassination was a tragic event, it also intensified the drive for civil rights and social justice in the U.S. and beyond. King's life and work continue to inspire individuals fighting for equality, peace, and justice around the world. King's legacy is perhaps best reflected in the tangible changes he fought for, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which dismantled much of the institutionalized segregation and disenfranchisement that had plagued Black Americans for generations. These legislative milestones were a direct result of his tireless work and advocacy, and they marked the beginning of a new era in which racial discrimination was slowly but surely being addressed. However, the fight was far from over. King's broader vision of economic equality, an end to poverty, and global peace continued to guide the movements that followed. In the decades since his assassination, King has remained a powerful symbol for various social justice movements. From the push for universal civil rights to contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter, his call for nonviolent protest and his demand for systemic change continue to shape activism. His speeches, most notably the "I Have a Dream" speech, remain pivotal moments in the struggle for racial equality. They are taught in classrooms, quoted in protests, and invoked in political debates, serving as a constant reminder of the work still left to do. The establishment of Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a federal holiday in 1983 further cemented his status as a national hero. The holiday, observed on the third Monday of January each year, serves as both a day of reflection on King's legacy and a call to action to continue the work he began. On this day, people across the country participate in service projects, marches and events aimed at promoting the values of justice, equality and peace that King championed throughout his life. However, King's legacy is not confined to the United States. His influence spread globally, inspiring movements in countries struggling with racial, economic, and social inequalities. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela and other anti-apartheid leaders often cited King as an inspiration in their fight against institutionalized racism. In India, King's philosophy of nonviolence resonated deeply with those following in the footsteps of Gandhi, as it provided a roadmap for peaceful resistance against oppression. King's legacy also serves as a powerful reminder of the cost of social change. His life and death underscore the lengths to which those in power will go to maintain the status quo, but also the resilience and strength of those who continue the fight for justice. In this sense, King is not only remembered for his accomplishments, but also for his unwavering commitment to his principles in the face of overwhelming adversity. His death, while tragic, amplified his message and made him an eternal figure in the struggle for equality and justice. As we look back on Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, we are reminded that the work he started is ongoing. The battles he fought in his lifetime are still relevant today. Issues of racial inequality, economic justice, and human rights are still pressing concerns, both in the US and globally. King's message continues to resonate, not as a call to remember the past, but as a call to action for a more just future. His vision for a society where people are judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin remains an aspiration that many are still striving toward. In the end, the question of how Martin Luther King Jr. died may never be answered definitively, but the more important question is how his life continues to inspire and challenge us today. His death may have been violent, but the legacy he left behind is one of peace, love, and an unrelenting pursuit of justice for all. It's a legacy that lives on in the hearts and minds of those who, like King, are committed to making the world a better place for future generations.